Right, in this first tutorial, we're going to look at using a MIDI keyboard to input a monophonic line into our sequencer, our DAW, which in this case is Studio 1 2, version 2. We're going to be using our New Zealand national anthem, and I'm going to be keeping it really simple. What I want to do first of all is not do anything too complicated musically, just so we can get comfortable with illustrating all of the concepts that we're going to need to be working through and keep in mind as we do all of our sequencing. So initially, a very easy piece to work on, a very straight, very even, 4/4 time, and we'll get on to something a little more complicated later on. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to be using Studio 1. I'm going to create a new song, God of Nations, and I'll leave it at 24-bit. We'll go okay. Now, I am assuming that you have already completed MUSTEC 1 or Unit Standard 27656, which for those of you in New Zealand high school system will understand that that is a unit standard that takes you through the basics of sequencing and using score editors such as Sibelius or MuseScore, Finale or Notion. So I'm going to assume you have a little bit of basic knowledge of how to use a sequencer, how to record into it, and maybe basic skills with notation as well for note entry and specifically Sibelius. If you don't have that though, if you haven't done that, or if you're not from New Zealand, I'm hoping that everything I do here shouldn't be too tough or too hard to figure out, and I'll try and talk through and explain everything as much as possible as I go. Okay, first I'm going to grab myself an instrument. I'll just keep it nice and straightforward, just go for a grand piano sound, drag and drop that in. Great, we've got some sound, it's always good to check. If you haven't used Studio 1 before, then the first time you add an instrument in, you might have to go and configure your MIDI keyboard by going configuring and adding it in. I have some other tutorials for that, which I think you can get earlier on in the iBook, which shows you how to set up Studio 1 and get it working. So, one thing we need to check out is what our time signature is. We are in 4/4, and that's what our piece of music is in, so it's very important to have that going. We have our tempo. I'm going to slow it down to something a little bit easier. Nice and easy, nice and slow, so I can concentrate on my performance. The wonderful thing about MIDI is that it's very easy to record stuff at slow tempos and then speed it up later. I need to double check my metronome or my click settings because I need to play along with the click. That is really, really important. Got my click samples. This is the sound of it there, and it's going to be accenting. It's going to give me 2 bars of counting. That's okay, and it's going to be clicking as I perform, as I record. So I'm going to let it do its 2 bars of click counting, and then I'm also going to give it another bar of counting before I start playing. It's a good idea to have a bar's rest or a bar's gap before you start doing your performance, in case you're a little bit early on there, in case you're a little bit earlier ahead of the beat. And that way it should quantize it a little bit easier later on, and I'll explain what quantizing is later. I know I've got a very simple melody to be working with here, so I'm going to make sure my grid spacing is at 1/8 notes, or quavers. You might have then noticed a whole bunch of little dots disappear from along the timeline. That is because it's now the grid markings, or those dots are just showing where the 1/8 notes are, or every half beat. Anyway, enough talking. Let's check the keyboard's working. Great, let's give this a go. Okay, not a great performance, but it'll do. It'll serve our purposes. You may have heard that I was slightly ahead of the beat quite often. I'm using a little MPK mini keyboard here. It's got some pretty funny keys. I'm not used to playing it, so that's part of the reason why I was delivering a bad performance, and also just because it's 5:45 in the morning and I haven't woken up and had any coffee yet. So, but anyway, we don't want it to be perfect performances because I want to show you a real-world situation of how we're going to fix things. So let's just create a bit of space here. Let's have a look at it. What does it look like? So you can see, yep, generally I'm ahead of the beat the whole time. Yikes, oh finally I got on the beat there at bar 7, but the rest of it, pretty much ahead of the beat. Now, I'm not too concerned about it though, because the length that I'm in front of the beat is going to be really easily fixable. So what I can do with this is I'm just going to make sure I do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to make sure my scale over here is set to the key that I'm working in. Now, this is where it's helpful to know a little bit of music theory with all of this. And I know that I'm in the key of G major. You may not know that if it's a piece of music that you've written or you've arranged and you've done it all by ear. And so this is where you can have another musician or a teacher help you. A little bit of information here stating that we're in G major, which has all of our Fs turned into F sharps, is going to be really helpful for us later on when it comes into adjusting pitches and working things out, particularly when we're putting chords in, and particularly if we're working off guitars, audio recorded from guitars. This is a really helpful thing. So anytime we move notes around now, it will snap to only the notes in the key of G major. And this piece of music, here we have at the moment, in terms of its melody line, is only in the key of G major. Later on in the piece, we do get some C sharps and some D sharps occurring in the harmony of the piece, but we'll deal with that at the time. Okay, so we've got our part in. I'm going to select all my notes, and I'm going to quantize them. Eighth notes, which we discussed earlier. Now, all the melody I played there, we had nothing faster than an eighth note or a quaver. There were no semiquavers, there were no swung eighth notes, there were no triplets. Everything was straight, nice and even, crotchets or quarter notes and quavers, which are eighth notes. So therefore, we want to leave our quantized grid value at eighth notes, and we can just fix it all just by pushing Q. Now, what we've done there is we've gone and shifted the start of all of the notes. Everything's now in the start, but for notation, it's really, really important that we get the ends of the notes going fully up to the other ones. So I'm going to look at my quantize options, and I'm going to change my end value to this thing here. Now, if you're not using Studio One, you need to look for this kind of value in your quantize or edit rhythms window. In Pro Tools, I think it's Alt+0 brings up the window for it. But we want to change it so that the ends of our notes are going to go 100%. Now, as I did that, you'll notice that all of the notes snapped to the start of the next note. There is now no gap in between, and that is exactly what we want. Really important point to remind you is that we are not interested in how it sounds here. I'm assuming that you've come up with an arrangement, you've recorded it into a digital audio workstation like Pro Tools or Logic or GarageBand, and that you have got it sounding just how you want it, that it sounds awesome. The purpose of what we're doing here is creating notation. What's important is how it looks. So, snapping all the notes straight up to each other like this won't sound good for some parts, as we're going to discover later on. Probably won't be too bad here, but the important thing is that we're not leaving any gaps. There are no intentional rests, so therefore there should be no gaps. So when we export this to Sibelius, it's going to look lovely. In fact, let's do that right now before we move on to our next instrument. I'm going to go File and Save As. And I am going to save it as, instead of a .song, I'm going to save it as a MIDI file. Okay, I'm just going to go to my desktop for now until I'll create a folder on my desktop where I'm going to keep all this. God of Nations tutorial files. And I'm going to save it into there. Now if I go to Sibelius, I can now import it. Now when I boot up Sibelius, we get this quick start window. If you haven't got it, you can go File and click Quick Start. I'm going to go to Import a MIDI file. Go to my desktop and find my MIDI file that I just created. And let's open it up. Now, a few things I want to quickly just figure out. I want to make sure I've got one staff per track. Yes, I do want to keep that. I quite like that. Hide empty staves. Yes, I want that. Over in notation, I'm going to make sure, I'm going to tell it at the moment, my minimum duration of notes is actually an 8th note, not a 16th note. And that will also help us with how it looks when we import it. I haven't actually used any tuplets or triplets, but I'll leave those there for now because I might later on. But there's no values of 6, 5, 7, 10, 9, and so on. So with those set, I'm going to now go OK. And here it is. Whole thing's in here. Everything's very low though. So what I'd want to do is I can actually, now that I've realized this, because it didn't occur to me just before, there's a couple of things I've realized I want to fix up. Number one, I want to fix up the track name. So over in Studio One, I don't want it to be called Grand Piano. I want it to be called Melody. So when I import it into Sibelius next time, the name of the stave will be correct as Melody. The other thing is everything is an octave too low. Well, I can fix that here. I can select it all, and I can go Command up arrow or Control up arrow if you're on Windows, and I can put it in. Notice I got these F sharps occurring, which is correct for the key of G major. So I might go and put here my key signature by pushing K for key and sticking that at the beginning. This hit point information, this tempo information, I'll fix all that up later on. It's very easy to do. So what I'm going to do back over here though, because I'm going to continue working in this project, is I'm going to make sure that all of my notes here are actually up at the right pitch. Everything was played in an octave too low. Now when I export it next time, it will be at the correct pitch. All right, so there we are. We've put in a monophonic line with the keyboard. I'll show you how to do the same thing with the guitar soon. It's time to move on to our next instrument.